I stepped out onto my porch at dawn, expecting the familiar quiet of my ranch, but instead I was hit with a sight that stopped me cold, a towering concrete wall, rising like a fortress, blocking my gate to the highway. There, in wrinkled khakis and clutching a clipboard, stood Diana Willoughby, the new HOA president from the fancy subdivision next door. 6 months in, and already the neighborhood's most feared figure. She was barking orders at a construction crew, no warning, no paperwork, just this monstrous barrier cutting off my road. The kicker? I'd never been entirely sure who owned that stretch of road, but it was my gate, my ranch. If you've ever felt pushed around on your own land, you know the fire that surged through me. What would you have done standing in my boots? It was 6 a.m., the hammering of metal yanking me from sleep, not the usual rooster's crow. From the bedroom window of the old farmhouse, home to 3 generations of Dunlops, I stared in disbelief at Diana, reigning over her crew like she owned my world. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any run-ins with your HOA. We'd love to narrate your story on our channel. Mushrooms after rain on what used to be the Johnson family's wheat fields. Her greying hair was a mess. Her old button-down shirt looked like she'd slept in it, but her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. She wasn't holding her usual clipboard today. Instead, she had an old tablet, constantly taking photos of what she probably called evidence. The construction crew looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. But they kept working, laying concrete, blocks one by one, creating what was quickly becoming an 8F tall barrier right across the entrance to my 200-acre ranch. I threw on my jeans and work boots, grabbed my coffee mug, and walked out to confront whatever this was. Diana saw me coming and put on this sickeningly sweet smile, the kind that makes your skin crawl because you know there's poison behind it. "Good morning, Mr. Dunlop," she called out in that fake, cheerful voice. "I'm just protecting the community's interests, you understand?" I looked at the wall, then at her, then back at the wall. "Ma'am, you're building on my road," I said, keeping my voice level the way my father had taught me. "Never let them see you sweat. Never give them ammunition." Deanna's smile got even wider, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Oh no, this road falls under HOA management jurisdiction. You can check the records if you'd like." The way she said it, like she was talking to a child who didn't understand grown-up rules, made my jaw clench. Standing there in the early morning, like watching strangers block the path my grandfather had used to drive cattle to market, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I'd left my job as a cold storage manager 3 states away to come home when Dad got sick. It was that same feeling of failure, that same question that had haunted me for months. Was I really cut out for this? Dad had made ranching look easy, but every day brought new challenges I wasn't sure I could handle. Now this woman, who had lived here all of 6 months, was telling me I didn't even own the road I'd been using my entire life. I remember Dad's words from when I was younger and hot-headed. "Son, when someone's looking for a fight, don't give them one right away. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is step back and figure out what you're really dealing with." So that's what I did. I told Diana we'd need to sort this out properly, went back inside and called Wesley Grant, the only lawyer in town who specialized in agricultural property rights. Wesley had been handling land disputes in our county for over 20 years, and when I explained the situation, the silence on his end of the line told me everything I needed to know. "Hank," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of bad news, "we need to look at this real careful. Like, hard jurisdictions can be tricky, especially when they involve roads that predate the development." He promised to dig into the property records and get back to me by the end of the week. As I hung up the phone, I looked out the window at that wall getting higher by the hour, and I had the sinking feeling that Deanna Willoughby had been planning this for a lot longer than just this morning. What I didn't know yet was that she'd been preparing for this battle for 4 months, ever since she'd first laid eyes on my ranch and decided it didn't fit her vision of what a proper neighborhood should look like. The sound of cement mixers and power tools continued all day, a constant reminder that my life was changing whether I wanted it to or not. By evening, the wall was complete, meeting private property with private property, residential area painted in neat black letters. As I stood there looking at it, I couldn't help but think about all the times my grandfather had driven his old Ford pickup down this very road, all the hay wagons and cattle trailers that had made this journey. Now there was a wall where there used to be freedom. And I was starting to understand that Diana Willoughby wasn't just building a barrier, she was drawing a line in the sand. Little did I know that in doing so, she just started a war she wasn't prepared to finish. When Wesley called me back 3 days later, his voice had that edge lawyers get when they found something that doesn't sit right. "Hank, you need to come into my office," he said, "and bring a strong cup of coffee." That afternoon, sitting in Wesley's cluttered office above the hardware store, I watched him spread out a collection of maps, property deeds, and legal documents that looked older than both of us combined. He pulled out a 1987 county map and drew a red line with his finger, tracing the boundaries of my property and the road that connected it to the state highway. "This road," he said, tapping the paper, "has never been under HOA jurisdiction. Diana, Willoughby has been lying to you." The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut, but what came next was even worse. Wesley had discovered that Diana had filed paperwork to change the road's classification 4 months ago, taking advantage of the fact that I rarely check my legal mail, a habit that was about to cost me dearly. The more Wesley dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Diana hadn't just targeted my ranch on a whim. She'd done her homework. She'd researched property values, studied HOA expansion laws, and even reached out to other HOA presidents who'd successfully forced out undesirable neighbors. "She's been talking to people, Hank," Wesley said, showing me printed emails he'd obtained through public records requests. "This woman has made it her personal mission to get rid of your ranch." The worst part was learning that she'd already won similar battles against 4 other property owners in the area using a combination of legal technicalities, bureaucratic pressure, and what could only be described as psychological warfare. Each victory had made her bolder, more confident that she could reshape the entire area according to her vision of suburban perfection. By the time I left Wesley's office, Diana's campaign against me was already in full swing. She'd hired Frank Morrison, a 68-year-old veteran with too much time on his hands and a security badge he'd bought online, to stand guard by the wall, wearing a bright yellow security armband. Frank took his job seriously, stopping anyone who tried to approach the wall and explaining to anyone who'd listened that he was protecting property values from agricultural pollution. Vienna had also enlisted Carol Jenkins, a 45-year-old woman whose idea of community service involved walking door-to-door, collecting signatures on a petition to remove livestock operations from residential areas. Carol's approach was more subtle than Frank's. She'd show up at neighbors' houses with homemade cookies and manila folders full of carefully selected statistics about property value impacts and health concerns related to farming operations. The immediate impact on my daily operations was devastating. Instead of the 10-minute drive to the highway, I now had to take a 15-minute detour through back roads that weren't designed for farm equipment. What used to be a simple trip to town for feed and supplies now took an extra 2 hours each way. Worse yet, I lost 3 transportation contracts because my clients weren't willing to wait for deliveries that suddenly took twice as long. The financial pressure was real. Between the lost income and the legal fees I was already accumulating, I was looking at a situation that could force me to sell the ranch within 6 months. As I lay awake that first night after learning the truth about Diana's scheme, staring at the ceiling fan that had been there since my childhood, I felt the weight of 3 generations of Dunlop history pressing down on me. That's when Clay Edwards knocked on my door. Clay had been the county sheriff for 12 years, but before that, he'd been the kid whose family had lost everything in a house here when I was in high school. My father had given Clay's family a place to stay for 6 months. No questions asked, no rent required, just neighbors helping neighbors the way it used to be done. Now Clay stood on my porch, hat in hand, with the kind of expression that told me he'd been wrestling with something. "Hank," he said, "I can't get involved officially, but I owe your family more than I can ever repay. If there's anything I can do to help you figure this out, you just let me know." Clay's offer meant more to me than he probably realized. In a situation where I felt increasingly isolated and outgunned, knowing I had at least one ally in law enforcement gave me hope that justice might still be possible. Meanwhile, there was one bright spot in this mess. June Halbrook lived 3 houses down from Deanna in the subdivision, and she'd been watching the situation unfold with growing disgust. June was a 38-year-old freelance writer who'd moved to the area for the peace and quiet, only to find herself living under Deanna's increasingly authoritarian rule. June had already been fined twice by the HOA, once for planting sunflowers that were allegedly too tall according to the community guidelines, and once for having a bird feeder that attracted excessive wildlife. When she saw Diana's wall go up, something snapped. June started documenting everything on social media, live streaming what she called HOA bullying in real time. Her first stream attracted 200 viewers and 50 comments, most of them from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Frank Morrison and Carol Jenkins were furious about June's broadcasts, claiming she was spreading fake news and threatening to file complaints against her for disturbing the peace. Wesley's final revelation that day changed everything. As he was packing up the maps and documents, he mentioned almost casually that the road had an interesting legal history. "The thing is, Hank," he said, "this road was built in 1962 by a development company that went bankrupt in 2019. Technically, the ownership has been in legal limbo ever since. If someone wanted to, they could probably purchase the usage rights from the bankruptcy liquidation office for a fraction of what you'd expect to pay." The way he said it with that little glint in his eye that told me he'd been thinking about possibilities I hadn't even considered made me sit up straighter. When Wesley called me later that evening, his voice had an excitement I hadn't heard since we were kids playing baseball behind the school. "Hank," he said, "I think I found your way out of this mess, but you're going to have to trust me, and you're going to have to be patient." I didn't know it yet, but Wesley had just handed me the key to turning Deanna's own game against her. The veto escalation started on a Tuesday night when I couldn't sleep. It had been 2 weeks since the wall went up, and the financial pressure was getting to me. I'd already had to let go of one part-time worker, and the stress was starting to show in ways I didn't like. Snapping at suppliers, losing my temper with equipment that wouldn't cooperate, lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if I was going to be the Dunlop who lost the family ran. Diana, meanwhile, had doubled down on her campaign. She'd called in environmental inspectors to test for agricultural pollution, claiming that runoff from my cattle operation was contaminating groundwater. Frank Morrison had embraced his role as Diana's enforcer with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a purpose in retirement. He'd upgraded his security badge to include a bright yellow HOA put armband and had taken to walking the perimeter of the wall like he was guarding Fort Knox. The night everything changed. I was sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning looking at photos of my father and grandfather that hung on the wall above the old oak table where 3 generations of my family had eaten their meals. The weight of potentially being the one who lost everything was crushing, and I found myself questioning every decision I'd made since coming back to take over the reign. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe Deanna was right that farming didn't belong in a modern suburban environment. Maybe I should just sell the place and find something else to do with my life. That's when I heard voices outside. Quiet, but not quiet enough. I turned off the kitchen light and looked out the window to see 2 figures near the wall, one of them holding what looked like a spray paint can. Even in the darkness, I recognized Deanna's distinctive silhouette and Carol's nervous bird-like movements. I watched in disbelief as they spray-painted "Go Away" in large red letters across the white section of the wall, the paint dripping down like blood in the moonlight. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were vandalizing their own wall and somehow planning to blame me for it. Sure enough, the next morning, Diana was on my doorstep at 7 sharp, pointing at the graffiti with theatrical outrage. "Look what you've done!" she screamed, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. "This is vandalism. This is harassment. I'm calling the police." Her performance was impressive. I had to give her that. She managed to work up actual tears while accusing me of defacing property that she'd illegally built on my road in the first place. But then she made a critical mistake. When I calmly suggested that maybe someone should check the security cameras in the area, Diana's face went white. "There are no cameras that would have caught this," she said quickly, then caught herself. I mean, whoever did this was obviously very careful to avoid detection. What Diana didn't know was that June Halbrook had installed her own security camera system after being harassed by Frank Morrison one too many times. June's camera had a perfect view of the wall, and she'd captured the entire spray painting incident in high deputable zone. When June showed me the footage later that morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole mess started. Hope. For the first time, I had concrete evidence of Deanna's duplicity. Proof that she wasn't just bending the truth, but actively manufacturing lies to support her campaign against me. But instead of immediately exposing Deanna, June had a better idea. "Let's see how far she's willing to take this lie," June suggested. "Sometimes the best way to catch someone is to give them enough rope to hang themselves." Diana, emboldened by what she thought was a successful frame job, began telling anyone who would listen that I had escalated to criminal behavior and was obviously becoming dangerous. She filed a police report claiming that I had not only vandalized the wall but had also been stalking and intimidating her and other residents. She even went so far as to suggest that the red paint was meant to represent blood, making it a violent threat rather than simple graffiti. Frank Morrison backed up her story completely, claiming he'd seen suspicious activity around my ranch late at night. Carol Jenkins organized a petition demanding that law enforcement take immediate action to protect the community from agricultural terrorism. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, with Diana's lies getting bigger and more elaborate by the day. Clay Edwards arrived at my ranch that afternoon, not in his official capacity, but as a neighbor who'd seen enough. "Hank," he said, "I've been watching this situation develop, and it's gone way beyond a simple property dispute. Diana Willoughby is conducting what amounts to a harassment campaign, and it needs to stop." Clay explained that while he couldn't take official action without proper evidence, he was very interested in seeing June's security footage. When June played the video for Clay, showing Diana and Carol clearly spray painting their own wall, his expression grew very serious. "This changes everything," he said. "Filing a false police report is a felony, and attempting to frame someone for a crime they didn't commit is another felony. Diana Willoughby has just made the biggest mistake of her life." The confrontation came. The next morning, when Clay arrived at Diana's house with an official warrant to search for evidence related to the vandalism incident, Diana answered the door in her bathrobe, clearly not expecting law enforcement to be taking her complaint so seriously. "Oh, Sheriff Edwards," she gushed, "I'm so glad you're finally taking action against that horrible man. I have so much more evidence to show you." But instead of asking for evidence against me, Clay asked to see Deanna's garbage cans, her garage, and any recent purchases of spray paint. The look of horror on Deanna's face when she realized she'd been caught was captured perfectly by June's live stream, which had attracted over 1,000 viewers who were following what had become known as the Ranch Wars. When Clay found the empty spray paint can in Deanna's recycling bin, still with her fingerprints on it, Deanna's entire facade crumbled. That evening, as I stood looking at those red letters dripping down the wall like an accusation, something fundamental shifted in my thinking. I was done being the victim in Diana's little power game. I was done apologizing for existing, done trying to accommodate someone who clearly had no intention of finding a reasonable solution. My father had always taught me that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, but you have to be smarter about it than your opponent. Deanna thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but she was about to learn that 3 generations of Dunlop's stubbornness had taught me a few things about strategy. Wesley's discovery about the road's ownership status was starting to look less like interesting trivia and more like the foundation of a counterattack. As I walked back to the house, I made a decision that would change everything. If Deanna wanted to play legal games, I was going to show her how the game was really played. The bankruptcy liquidation office was located in a grey government building downtown that smelled like old coffee and bureaucracy. Wesley and I sat across from a clerk who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, pushing papers that would make me the legal owner of 8/10 of a mile of private roadway for the bargain price of $12,000. Most people don't even know the stuff is for sale, the clerk explained as she processed the paperwork. Can bankrupt assets get tied up in legal proceedings for years and then everything gets sold off cheap just to clear the books? The road purchase was just the beginning of my plan. While the legal paperwork was being processed, I spent my time at the county auction yard acquiring 8 used tractors in various states of repair. 4 of them I had painted bright yellow like sunflowers. The other 4 a deep red like ripe tomatoes, the colors of farming, the colors of the agricultural life Diana was so determined to eliminate. Meanwhile, Diana had escalated her harassment campaign to new levels of absurdity. She'd started issuing official-looking violation notices for things like excessive noise from agricultural equipment and improper storage of farming materials, none of which had any legal authority, but all of which looked official enough to fool people who didn't know better. She'd also convinced the county to send inspectors for environmental compliance reviews that required me to take time away from actual work to escort bureaucrats around my property while they looked for violations that didn't exist. Every inspection cost me money and lost productivity, and every frivolous complaint required expensive responses from Wesley just to maintain my legal standing. Diana was systematically trying to make ranch operations too expensive and time-consuming to continue. Carol Jenkins had become Deanna's lieutenant in this campaign, organizing what she called community safety patrols that were really just opportunities to trespass on my property and document anything that could be turned into a complaint. Frank Morrison had appointed himself as the neighborhood's unofficial law enforcement officer, stopping delivery trucks and service vehicles to demand identification and explanations for their business at my ranch. The combination of bureaucratic harassment and neighborhood vigilantism was creating exactly the kind of pressure Diana intended, making normal business operations so difficult that selling the ranch would seem like the reasonable solution. What Diana didn't realize was that every action she took was making me more determined to fight back and more willing to use every legal tool at my disposal. Wesley had been quietly researching Deanna's background while we processed the road purchase, and what he found explained a lot about her tactics. "She's done this before, Hank," he told me over coffee one morning. "Diana Willoughby has a pattern of moving into areas, identifying properties she wants to acquire, and then using a combination of legal pressure and community manipulation to force sales at below-market prices. She's not just trying to get rid of your ranch. She's trying to buy it cheap so she can subdivide it and make a fortune." This revelation changed everything about how I understood the conflict. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was about money, pure and simple. Diana saw my ranch as a business opportunity, and she was willing to destroy my life to make a profit. The moment I became the legal owner of the road, everything changed. Wesley registered Dunlop Ranch Transportation, LLC, as a legitimate business entity, giving me the legal standing to operate commercial vehicles on my own private property. The sign installation was the finishing touch, a large professional marker that read, "Police Road. Dunlop Branch Transportation, LLC, will be towered, E-submissive buildings furnished." June helped design smaller signs that would be mounted on each tractor, identifying them as mobile agricultural equipment private property. The 8 tractors, now painted in their bright yellow and red livery, were arranged along the road in perfect formation, like mechanical soldiers guarding the entrance to my ranch. Diana's reaction to the road purchase was everything I'd hoped for and more. When she realized that the road she'd been blocking was now my legal property, her carefully constructed authority began to crumble. She tried to claim that the purchase was fraudulent, that I'd somehow manipulated the system to steal community property. She organized emergency HOA meetings to discuss illegal property seizure and agricultural terrorism against residential communities. Frank Morrison and Carol Jenkins supported her completely, but other neighbors were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about how Deanna had known so much about road ownership laws and property classifications. June's documentation of Deanna's increasingly desperate behavior was attracting viewers from across the region. People who were fascinated by the spectacle of an HOA president being outmaneuvered by a quiet rancher. The beauty of my position was its complete legality. I owned the road. I had proper business registration. My vehicles were legally parked on my own property, and there was absolutely nothing Deanna could do about it through official channels. Every complaint she filed was dismissed. Every inspection she requested found no violations, and every legal threat she made was revealed to be baseless bluster. For the first time since this conflict began, I had all the power, and Diana was the one scrambling to find a response. The woman who'd spent months lecturing me about property rights and legal jurisdiction was now learning what it felt like to be on the wrong side of both. As I sat on my lead tractor that first morning, drinking coffee and watching Diana pace frantically in her front yard, I realized that sometimes justice comes not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient preparation and superior strategy. Diana Willoughby was about to learn that underestimating quiet people is a very expensive mistake. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes you grateful to be alive, and I was up before dawn making final preparations for what June had started calling the Great Tractor Reveal. By 5:30 in the morning, I had all 8 tractors lined up along my newly purchased road in perfect formation. 4 bright yellow machines alternating with 4 deep red ones, creating a colorful barrier that stretched for nearly 200 yards. Each tractor flew a small American flag from its antenna, and the sight of them arranged like mechanical soldiers. Protecting the homeland was more impressive than I'd even imagined. The centerpiece was the large professional sign, Pilots Road, Dunlop Ranch, Transportation, LLC. Authorized vehicles only. I positioned myself on the lead tractor with a thermos of coffee and settled in to wait for Diana's reaction. June's live stream went active at 7 all sharp, and within minutes she had over 500 viewers watching what she'd titled Justice Day, When Farmers Fight Back. "Good morning, everyone," June announced from her position where she had a perfect view of both my tractor formation and Diana's house. "Today is the day we find out what happens when someone who's used to pushing people around meets someone who knows how to push back." The energy in her voice was infectious, and comments were pouring in. "This is genius. Give that farmer a medal. HOA Karen is about to lose her mind." Diana's reaction exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. At 7:30 sharp, she burst out of her front door like a woman possessed, her hair flying in all directions, and her face red with fury. She was still wearing a bathrobe and slippers, but she'd grabbed a can of red spray paint, the same paint she'd used to vandalize her own wall. The sight of her running toward my tractors with that spray paint can broadcast live to hundreds of viewers was so perfect that it seemed scripted. Diana approached the first tractor. Spray paint can raised like a weapon, screaming something that was mostly incoherent rage, punctuated by words like illegal and harass. That's when I climbed down from my tractor and delivered the line I'd been practicing for days. I walked calmly to the large Parliament Road sign, pointed directly at it with one hand while holding my coffee mug in the other, and said in the most level voice I could manage, "Ma'am, can you read what this sign says?" The effect was immediate and devastating. Diana stopped mid-stride, the spray paint can still raised above her head as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Behind her, Frank Morrison and Carol Jenkins emerged from their houses drawn by the commotion, but not yet understanding what they were looking at. Diana's response was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. "You can't do this," she screamed, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. "This is fraud. This is a scam." She seemed to run out of accusations and just stood there sputtering, while I continued to sip my coffee with the patience of someone who'd finally gained the upper hand. Frank Morrison approached cautiously, clearly trying to assess the situation. And when he realized what had happened, his face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, resignation. The arrival of Clay Edwards in his patrol car was the final stroke of genius. Clay took his time getting out of the vehicle, walking slowly toward the confrontation like a man who had all the time in the world. "Morning, folks," he said in that calm, professional voice. "Seems like there's some kind of disturbance here." Diana immediately launched into a tirade about illegal parking, harassment, and property violations, waving her spray paint can around for emphasis while apparently forgetting that she was essentially confessing to attempted vandalism on live stream. Clay listened patiently, then asked to see my documentation. I handed him the folder Wesley had prepared, containing my ownership papers, business registration, and vehicle permits. Clay examined everything carefully, nodded, and announced to the growing crowd, "Everything appears to be in order here. This is private property, and Mr. Dunlop has every right to park his equipment on his own road." The moment when Diana realized she'd been completely outmaneuvered was captured in perfect high-definition detail by June's camera. You could literally watch the realization wash over her face. First confusion, then disbelief, then the dawning horror that she'd been beaten at her own game. Frank Morrison tried one last desperate gambit, declaring that this road had been used by the community for 20 years and therefore had traditional right-of-ways status. Clay Edwards' response was swift and decisive. "Sir, you can check with the county registrar's office if you'd like, but traditional usage doesn't override legal ownership." The crowd that had gathered was clearly divided. Some residents looked angry and confused. Others seemed impressed by the elegant justice of the situation, and a few were openly laughing at Deanna being hoisted by her own petard. June's live stream had grown to over 2,000 viewers, with comments pouring in from across the region as words spread about the HOA president who'd met her match. As Deanna retreated to her house, dragging Frank and Carol with her, I couldn't help but feel deep satisfaction at the symmetry of the situation. For months, she'd used walls and barriers to control my life, and now I'd created my own barrier, one that was completely legal, undeniably effective, and painted in colors that celebrated the agricultural life she'd tried so hard to eliminate. The 8 tractors, yellow and red like a sunset over farmland, would remain parked on my road as long as I saw fit. A daily reminder to Diana Willoughby and anyone else who might be watching that sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you need to worry about most. But as I climbed back onto my tractor to enjoy my coffee in the morning sunshine, I had no idea that Diana was already planning her most desperate gambit yet, one that would backfire so spectacularly that it would make this morning's humiliation look like a minor embarrassment. The war was far from over, but for the first time since it began, I was the one setting the terms of engagement. 3 weeks after my tractor deployment, Diana played what she clearly believed was her trump card. She hired Marcus Whitfield, a high-pressed lawyer from the state capital who specialized in property rights litigation and charged $800 an hour. The lawsuit they filed claimed I was abusing property ownership rights for personal vendetta purposes and creating a public nuisance through deliberate obstruction. Deanna had convinced herself that because she was paying top dollar for legal representation, victory was inevitable. She'd even organized a protest for the day of the hearing, hiring about 40 people to carry signs reading, "Stop Property Abuse and Fairness for Family." The morning of the court hearing, June positioned herself on the courthouse steps with her camera, broadcasting to an audience that had grown to over 3,000 regular viewers. Diana arrived in a black sedan, flanked by her expensive lawyer, and followed by protesters who honestly looked like they had no idea what they were protesting. Inside the courtroom, Dion's confidence was immediately apparent. She had dressed in her most professional outfit and carried herself with the bearing of someone absolutely certain of victory. Marcus Whitfield opened with what he clearly considered a devastating argument. "Your Honor, the defendant has purchased this roadway for the sole purpose of harassing his neighbors and disrupting a peaceful residential community. This is weaponized property ownership." He presented photographs of my tractor formation, maps showing traditional usage patterns, and statements claiming their quality of life had been severely impacted. What Whitfield and Diana hadn't counted on was Wesley Grant's thorough preparation. Wesley had spent weeks building a case that went far beyond simple property rights. And when he stood up to present my defense, he had evidence that would change everything. "Your Honor," Wesley began, "before we discuss property rights, I think the court needs to understand the real motivation behind this lawsuit." He then presented email communications between Diana and Riverside Development Corporation obtained through legal discovery. Emails that revealed Diana's true plan for my ranch. The first email, dated 6 months before the wall construction, laid out her strategy. "I will force Dunlop into bankruptcy within 6 months, then purchase his property for $800,000 instead of the market value of $1.2 million. The courtroom went completely silent as Wesley read the second email. "I've already contacted 3 construction companies about subdividing the ranch into 25 residential lots. Conservative profit estimates show a return of $2.5 million once the agricultural operations are eliminated." The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as Wesley presented evidence of DA's methodical campaign to destroy my livelihood for personal profit. There were emails discussing pressure point strategies, correspondence with regulatory agencies designed to create maximum harassment, and even a timeline showing how Diana had coordinated her actions to maximize economic impact. The picture that emerged was not of a concerned neighbor, but of a calculating manipulator who turned neighborhood harassment into a business plan. Marcus Whitfield's confident demeanor evaporated completely when Wesley presented the final piece of evidence, a recorded phone call between Diana and a demolition contractor, discussing clearing the ranch property for development by Christmas. The recording, obtained legally through discovery, captured Diana laughing about how that stupid farmer doesn't even know what's coming. The courtroom gasped audibly. Judge Patricia Harrison's reaction was swift and unforgiving. This court, she announced in a voice that could have frozen the room, does not look favorably upon the abuse of legal processes for personal financial gain. What I'm seeing here is not a good-faith property dispute, but a calculated campaign of harassment designed to force the sale of private property through economic duress. She not only dismissed Diana's lawsuit, but imposed sanctions that would make this legal adventure very expensive. Diana was ordered to pay $30,000 in court costs and legal fees, plus an additional $10,000 in compensatory damages for frivolous litigation designed to circumvent legitimate property rights. The judge's final order required Diana to remove her wall within 48 hours and prohibited her from filing any further legal actions related to my property without prior court approval. As court adjourned, Diana sat in complete shock, apparently unable to process that her expensive legal strategy had not only failed, but had exposed her true motivations in the most public and humiliating way possible. Outside the courthouse, June's live stream captured Diana's complete breakdown as she fled from reporters and curious onlookers, her expensive lawyer nowhere to be seen, and her hired protesters already dispersing. Frank Morrison and Carol Jenkins looked lost and confused, finally beginning to understand that they'd been manipulated by someone whose real goal had nothing to do with community standards. As Diana's black sedan pulled away from the courthouse, June turned to her camera and delivered what would become the most watched moment of her coverage. And that, folks, is what happens when greed tries to disguise itself as community concern. Standing on those courthouse steps, watching Diana's retreat, and knowing that my tractors would remain exactly where I'd parked them for as long as I wanted them there, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began. Peace. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the deeper contentment that comes from knowing the system had worked the way it was supposed to, that truth had won out over manipulation, and that someone who tried to destroy my life had instead destroyed her own credibility completely. The wall that had started this whole conflict would be gone within 2 days, but the lessons learned would last much longer for Diana, for the community, and for anyone else who might be tempted to use legal bullying to get what they wanted from neighbors who just wanted to be left alone. 3 months after the courthouse victory, life had settled into a new normal that was better than anything I could have imagined when Diana first started building her wall. The concrete barrier was gone, demolished within the court-ordered 48 hours by a crew that Diana had to pay for herself. My 8 tractors remained parked along the road every Sunday, not out of spite, but because they'd become something of a local attraction. The HOA elected June as their new president in a landslide vote, and her first act was to revise the community guidelines to focus on actual safety issues rather than aesthetic micromanagement. Frank Morrison had become one of my most reliable helpers after learning how he'd been manipulated, and the monthly Ranch Day events that June organized brought the community together in ways that Diana's rigid enforcement never could. Clay Edwards had been promoted to county sheriff after his handling of our situation earned praise from the community. My business had not only recovered, but had actually grown stronger with new customers who specifically wanted to work with. The farmer who stood up to the HOA. Wesley Grant had become something of a local celebrity, with other property owners seeking his help in dealing with HOA overreach. June's social media following had exploded to over 15,000 regular viewers, and she'd started monetizing her content through sponsorships. The personal growth I'd experienced during this conflict was perhaps the most valuable outcome of all. I'd learned that being quiet and rural didn't mean being powerless, and that sometimes the most effective response to aggression is patient, strategic thinking rather than immediate retaliation. 6 months after the court hearing, I was working in the barn when I received an email that made me laugh out loud. It was from a law firm in Colorado representing someone who wanted to remain anonymous, but was interested in purchasing my road for $50,000, more than 4 times what I'd paid for it. The email included an apology for any misunderstandings that may have occurred in the past and an assurance that the buyer had learned valuable lessons about community relations and property rights. I didn't need to be a detective to figure out who was behind this offer. And the fact that Diana was willing to pay such a premium to undo the consequences of her own actions was both amusing and satisfying. My response was brief and to the point. Thank you for the offer and the apology. The road is not for sale. However, if the interested party would like to visit the area again, they're welcome to use the road free of charge, as long as they don't bring spray paint. Today, a year and a half after this whole saga began, my road bears a new sign that June helped me design. Dunlop Ranch Road, private property, visitors welcome, no spray paint allowed. With a small American flag logo, the 8 tractors still line the road every Sunday, now joined by families taking pictures and kids asking questions about farming. Diana's former house has new owners, a young family with children who love visiting the ranch. The subdivision is thriving under June's leadership, with community events that bring people together rather than driving them apart. The ranch that I once worried I might lose has become stronger than ever. And the community that was once divided by fear and manipulation has been united by shared experiences and mutual respect. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm grateful for the lessons learned and the relationships built, even though I wouldn't want to repeat the experience. Diana Willoughby taught me that some people will always try to use power and authority to get what they want, but she also taught me that such people can be defeated by patience, preparation, and a thorough understanding of the rules they think they're above. Sometimes justice comes slowly, but when it arrives, it brings with it the kind of satisfaction that money can't buy and bullies can't take away. So, what do you think? Should I have sold that road for $50,000? Or should I keep it as a reminder that justice doesn't always come easy, but it's worth fighting for when it finally arrives? Let me know in the comments if you've ever been pushed to your limit and had to find a way to push back. I read every single comment, and I love hearing from folks who understand what it's like when someone tries to make you back down from what's rightfully yours. The next story might just top this.